Welcome to this lecture in Anthropology, Lecture 7 on the knowledge of landscapes. We're essentially going to be talking about environmental anthropology, the relationship of humans to their environment. For ancient Egypt, that's going to be a little bit different. We live in a world where we think about concepts of environmental justice, ideas about environmentalism, worrying about climate change. And these are concerns that the ancient Egyptians didn't really have quite so much, other than when the Nile didn't flood enough. And of course, that made harvest less and threatened with famine. Theirs was a world in which their population was small enough that they could extract resources, search for resources from other places, and not feel as if they were exhausting the bounty of the earth. So we do have to keep in mind that some of the things we think about for environmental anthropology won't exactly translate into their experience because we inhabit a different world than they did. So let's begin with some key questions. So obviously, looking at the environmental anthropology of a group of people invites us to think about whether that group of people think of themselves as embedded in their natural world, or are they above it? Are they the stewards of and protect it? Or do they see themselves as interconnected with the world around them? They're one with the environment, nature. Another question is, to what extent does the environment determine human cultural and societal development? Are we the products of our environment? Or in some ways, can we transcend our environment or push back against our environment? And then finally, what are the mental maps that people have to conceive of the world that they live in? How do they map space and the resources and the nature that exists within that space? And what does that say about them as people? These are some big questions that we could translate to any culture in the world. But let's take a look at ancient Egypt, some of which we're going to talk about in the next few slides will be kind of familiar to you in my introduction to the Egyptian environment, to the landscape. Egypt, as we've already hinted at before, had a pretty unique ecosystem, it being the gift of the river Nile, which was this green stripe of prosperity through a country that was desert-like and full of sand and had threatening, environmental conditions on either side of the river. And that's a pretty interesting ecosystem for the ancient Egyptians. We have our own ecosystem, every culture does, and that's just the interaction between the people in that environment and then the non-living aspects, the rocks, the trees, the layout of the land. The Egyptian ecosystem is also shaped by its climate. It's a very dry place, very little rainfall, very warm, and that affects things like the growing season, that affects, the everyday rhythm of life. Think about, for example, just weather patterns and how they affect seasons in our world. And imagine, of course, the Egyptians doing it in understanding their world differently because of the way their climate worked. It would be fair to say the ancient Egyptians' lives were very much determined by their environment. They had far less technological capacity than we do to change their, reaction to the environment. I mean, consider the ancient Egyptian heat. for example, it's very, very hot and very difficult to bear, and so you just kind of have to put up with that and find ways to deal with that. In the evenings, for example, taking advantage of the cooling by being outside on the roof of your house. Whereas our culture has air conditioning, and we can move to places that are hot and not be bothered by it. So their lack of technology relative to us means that the environment really had an impact on their world. And then, of course, they learn to deal with that. I think it would behoove us to be careful to say, though, that having an environmental impact on a people will not necessarily always predict that the response will be the same. Living next to the River Nile doesn't exactly tell you how the Egyptians are going to respond to that. You can't say that, all peoples living next to rivers are going to respond exactly the same way. There'll be broad similarities. So the form that a culture takes is going to be slightly varied in response to environmental conditions that are same, because people are going to vary. So the people of the Tigris Euphrates in Mesopotamia will have a dependence on rivers, and the rivers will be important in their world. But their response to the Tigris and Euphrates won't be exactly the same as the Egyptian response. So keep in mind, similar environmental conditions don't exactly predict what people are going to be like in their cultural responses. So ecosystems shape, but they don't exactly 100% determine in a way that we can say is going to be the same for all people. We all, ancient Egyptians included, develop mental representations of our landscapes. That is, we have concepts of what the landscape means, what it is, where things are, mental maps. These are, composed of knowledge, facts, images, conceptualizations of the space around us that become part of our culture. Living here in Bexley, you have mental representations of what Bexley is, and how the space is divided, and who lives where, and where can you go for food, and what kind of area the school occupies, and what's around that. And the ancient Egyptians are no different. Those mental representations of their landscape and their space would contain elements of what we would consider science. That is like an environmental science of, if I go do this, this is what's going to happen over here. If I go out into the desert, I will surely die because it's hot and dry. I need water out there. But those landscapes also for the ancient Egyptians contain elements of mythology. Beliefs, traditions, religious ideas concerning the landscape. The River Nile is the god Hapi. The deserts are, personified by Set, the animal of disorder and chaos. It's not even a real animal because it's outside of the human norm of what we consider to be appropriate nature. And we do some of the same things in our own world. If you've ever had a mythology about a place that you believed was haunted or was deeply religious and sacred to you, that would be part of your mythological conception of space. And just so you don't think that we're only talking about the natural world of trees and rocks and rivers, built landscapes by human beings are also part of the mental universe. So the things that humans add to their cultural landscape becomes part of their mental representation of it. And that's important to consider when you think about the size of something like the temple at Karnak. which was consistently added to by Egyptian kings who wanted to establish their own proof of piety and devotion, leave their legacy, leave their mark. And so let's add another court, another pylon, another sacred space to this already huge temple world. And of course, an ordinary Egyptian who came in contact with Karnak, say during festival times, whatever limited contact they could have, would have a conceptualization of what that space is like, where you can go, what's an acceptable place that I can be in versus a place I can't be in because I'm not a priest. So human beings have a deep and powerful relationship with their environment in which they conceptualize what it means and think about the meaning of that space, both in a science way, like this is what the space gives me, this is what I know to be true of the space, as well as what the space means in a sacred or mythological way. We already talked about the Nile. I want to say just in general, watery landscapes feature pretty powerfully in Egyptian mythology and Egyptian iconography. The Nile obviously being important, the Delta, the watery, marshy landscape in the north or lower Egypt. The idea of the god Atum emerging on the Ben out of the primeval waters of creation. Water appears in representations of the underworld that we will see and talk a little bit later when we get to the New Kingdom. Water appears in tomb paintings, so you see pictures of marshes and watery areas. For example, we'll just talk about briefly here. This is the Amduat, or the underworld, and this is an illustration from the papyrus of Nesmin, about 300 BCE, in which the sun god is on a boat proceeding through a fertile, watery region in the underworld, not unlike the Delta, in fact. As he makes his travels through, the process of regenerating himself at night before he emerges in the morning completely regenerated. So water would feature very strongly in Egyptian consciousness. You would expect that a people who were highly dependent on water, it would show up in lots of different ways in their culture. Here's just one illustration. This is the tomb of Meruka. This is an old kingdom mastaba in Saqqara, which we'll be talking a little bit about. But for right now, just pay attention to the fact that there's water represented here. These are fishermen catching the fish. You see waterfowl, lotus plants represented here. So obviously water is an important source of life. It's a source of travel, and it becomes an important theme in art. And obviously the resources of ancient Egypt are important for a concept we call carrying capacity. Every people live in an environment that can either sustain them or it cannot. And sometimes the environment changes and the people have to move to a new place. So migration in search of new resources becomes a theme you see quite often in many cultures. As far as Egypt goes, water is an incredibly important part of that story because it enables the Egyptians to become proficient and exceptionally good in agriculture to sustain populations. So the carrying capacity is how much can the environment sustain the human population. When you consider the Nile Valley is very hot, has very little vegetation and low rainfall, the dependence on the Nile is incredibly important for the ancient Egyptians. Scholars estimate that the population of ancient Egypt is between 1 and 1.5 million during, the time period just after the unification, Narmer, in the 3rd millennium BCE. This is, of course, a population supported by intensive agriculture and the ability to utilize the Nile floods to sustain a population. The Egyptians didn't just passively accept the Nile floods and go, "Thank you, Nile flood, woo!" They actively managed their landscape. And I think that's important to think about in environmental anthropology. People don't necessarily just look at a landscape and go, "Yeah, that's the way it is." Humans change landscapes. And some landscapes are easier to change than others. If you've had me for U.S. history, we've talked about mound building cultures in the United States, where the native peoples actively changed the landscape around them by piling up dirt and creating burial mounds or ceremonial mounds. Well, the Egyptians changed the water landscape. For example, the scorpion mace head depicts King Scorpion at some kind of canal opening event. And we have evidence to suggest that the building of canals was undertaken in order to improve and utilize the Nile flood effectively. We have evidence for draining of land in the delta to reclaim areas in order to increase agriculture production. The 12th dynasty kings doing projects to make the Fayum Basin productive, to contain water for future use. All of this is indicative of humans attempting to modify the carrying capacity to get more out of their landscape. And this is the scorpion mace head. You can see here King Scorpion engaging in some kind of activity here of impacting the environment in a way that would benefit the people and increase power by increasing agricultural production, which increases food supplies, which, yes, it all carries off, or it all multiplies. Obviously, the direct result of all this carrying capacity made possible by water, thank you, water, is harvest. And so it's not a surprise that the Egyptians frequently depict harvest in their tomb paintings for lots of reasons. One, it's like a part of their world. It's a key, part of the way they are. But of course, they also believe that in the afterlife, it is necessary to have visual representation of all the good things about life so that those things come to life and supply you in the afterworld. I've already mentioned the Tomb of Meruka, 6th dynasty, important and highly titled leader and priest who built quite a large tomb for himself, his wife and son. And we'll be looking at some more pictures of it to show you the harvest scenes here. The Egyptians were able to maximize the storage of harvest through state and then temple granaries. So the state had its own system of storing grain for the usage of the king. Temples had their own control over agricultural plots as well. And interestingly enough, it features in the world's first worker strike in world history, about 1159 BCE, when a bunch of craftsmen at a village called Deir el-Medina weren't paid their rations. They weren't paid their food. They weren't given what was owed to them. And these weren't just, workers who were ordinary, craftsmen. These were the workers who were building the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. That is the Pharaoh's tomb. They're making the objects, painting the tomb paintings, digging out those underground tombs. And they were tired of not getting paid. This actually happened more than once. So they actually staged a sit-in strike at the Temple of Tutmos, and the priests at one point tried to sort of bribe them with a little bit of food and say, here's something to eat, go away. The workers weren't pacified, and they actually broke in, and police were called. It was a mess, indicative of general weakness going on at the time of Ramses III. We'll talk more about that later because it's such a fascinating story. All of this is to say that the Egyptians were heavily invested in a world of agriculture, and it's no wonder that it features in so many different aspects of their lives, from tombs like the tomb of Merope here shown, that's the diagram of it, to the world's first worker strike on a temple granary. Here is a harvest scene from the tomb of Merope. So you can see the guys there cutting the harvest so that they can have the grain to bake the bread and make the beer. More on that later. But the life of a working farm guy was not always a nice one in ancient Egypt, and there's quite a bit of literature from ancient Egypt lamenting the life of the farmer, though I will have to be fair and say that most of this is from people practicing to become scribes, people practicing to learn the Egyptian language and be able to read and write it. So most of them are writing, oh, how good it is to be a scribe. It sucks to be a farmer. This is from the Papyrus Lansing. It's much later in Egyptian history, the 20th dynasty. Oh, the poor farmer. When he reaches the fields, he finds it broken up. He spends time cultivating, and the snake is after him. It finishes off the seed as it casts to the ground. He does not see a green blade. Oh, be a scribe. Being a farmer is terrible. Here is another one. The farmer wails more than a guinea fowl. He's just like, all the time. His voice is louder than a raven. Notice here, too, references to the natural world creeping in poetry, right? We've just compared a farmer to two different kinds of birds. His fingers are swollen from working with his hands. And my favorite line, instinct to excess. The life of a farmer is hard. This is from the Satire of the Trades, the 18th, 19th dynasties. There's several copies in both time periods. The Egyptians clearly were very aware of the world around them. And there's been a lot of work recently on the Egyptians as sort of natural historians, taking, for example, a note of exactly how many kinds of animals did they paint in tomb paintings, and did they differentiate between the animals? Did they show like all kinds of cattle as the same, or did they show animals in ways to indicate that they were paying attention to them in almost like a biological sense? And in fact, the answer is yes. The Egyptians were kind of, I wouldn't say awesome biologists, but they are noticing differences and painting them into their art such that the animals look different. We know, for example, that the Egyptians paid a lot of attention to animals that are now extinct after the climate of Egypt changed. Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, animals disappear in the Nile Valley that used to be more present. And so we can see those animals in early art, and then they disappear in later art. There's actually a scholar who's suggesting, I think it's a very interesting argument, that as these animal populations die out, because Egypt's climate's getting drier, it's pushing people to the river and forcing them to become more dependent on agriculture. So this is a kind of an early argument that climate change in ancient Egypt, as measured by depiction of animals in art, is pushing people into agriculture because they can't hunt for these things that they used to hunt for. Egyptians had a rich depiction of animals in their art. There's a hippopotamus killing a crocodile. It's pretty cool. Lions, which disappear, I think, if memory serves me correctly, after the Second Dynasty. So very powerful image, shows up in goddess Sekhmet, for example, but not actually really in Egypt, after the Second Dynasty is over. Image again from a tomb of Meroruca. This is animal husbandry. So notice we've got all these animals drawn here with these curved horns. These animals here on their bellies. Clearly the Egyptians are paying attention to what kinds of animals there are. It does even show up in the language, when you've got hieroglyphs that feature owls or vultures or quail chicks. Hieroglyph for the horned viper, for example. So the Egyptians are aware of their natural world. Not quite biologists by our standard, but certainly not ignorant either. I want to take some time to talk about something that's missing from the Egyptian environment, because often we think about the environment as like what's here, but if you have experience in other places, it teaches you to compare your environment to other environments. And one thing that's very much clear when you go to Egypt is that they do not have the large, straight, huge trees that we do. In a dry environment, like ancient Egypt was, there are not that many trees nehet. And thus trees occupy a very sacred place in lots of different ways in Egypt, because they're so rare. They certainly have them, and they certainly have different kinds of trees. But when they go to other places and see, oh my gosh, you have these giant trees. Wow, those are so impressive. It does make the Egyptians appreciate what they have in contrast to what other places have. In Egyptian mythology, trees like the sycamore are linked to Hathor and the goddess Nut. Hathor is sometimes called the Lady of the Sycamore. The Persea tree, or shed, the leaves of that tree supposedly were inscribed with the name and reign of the pharaoh by the goddess Shashat, the goddess of writing, and the god Thoth, the god of wisdom and learning. Palm stems are actually the hieroglyph for time, Renpet. And the thought processes, the notches in it were used to represent the passage of time. So you just take this palm stem and you cut and go, well, we've been this many times since whatever the event was. Now, the Egyptians did trade. We mentioned this before. They're not isolated in the Nile Valley, and they go to places like what would today be Lebanon, Syria, Israel, for large trees like cedar and pine and other hardwoods for building of all kinds of things. And it's very important for the Egyptians to have access to these hardwoods. Here we have an illustration of Thutmose III in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings from 1450 BCE, being nourished by the tree there, drawing nourishment from it, you can see. One of my favorite illustrations, because I'm a cat person, this is the great cat of Heliopolis. An important figure in the stories of the underworld and travels of the sun god Re through the underworld. And he is killing the great snake Apophis in order to protect the sycamore tree. So you see here the sycamore tree drawn. That's a pretty intensive looking cat there. And then finally, the hieroglyph for time. I know it's hard to tell, Renpet, but this is a palm stem representing the passage of time. We're going to close with this already long lecture at a look at one of the most interesting and fascinating kings of Egypt, Hatshepsut, the pharaoh, about 1500 to 1450 BCE, who kind of did the world's first tree expedition. She did it for a lot more than just trees, but this is a garden-inspired expedition. She sent people to the south of Egypt to a land called Punt. There's a lot of debate about where Punt is located. For trees, among many things. We will talk about that expedition later because it gives us some fantastic imagery of the people of Punt that we can take a look at. Some of those trees may have been brought back to her funerary temple at Deir el-Bahari. We're not sure exactly where they went. Probably the trees that were most valuable from Punt, the frankincense and myrrh trees, those 31 trees brought back, were put somewhere else and kept safe for the production of aromatic spices, which are valued. If you've ever smelled frankincense and myrrh, I don't actually find the smell of them pretty exciting, but, you know, whatever floats your boat. That is Hatshepsut, depicted in pharaonic imagery. So she's got the false beard, you know, which you expected. She's wearing the crown. This is an illustration of the bringing back of the trees. You can see here they're lifting the trees up. They've had their root balls protected so that they can be hauled back to Egypt. And here is an artist's reconception of what the temple of Deir el-Bahari would have looked like as leading up to it, the sort of like garden-like atmosphere that it was invoking here as you would walk up into this mortuary temple for the pharaoh. Leave you finally with an image of the temple as it appears today. It is one of the most gorgeous, architecturally pleasing temples in ancient Egypt in design. This must have been phenomenal when it was created and set the way it is set in the Egyptian landscape, which I'll leave you with that thought as well. As the Egyptians built into the world around them, into the hills, in the cliffs, in the sides of the Nile Valley, they were adding their man-built environments into the natural world around them. And this temple, perhaps more than any of the others, represents a beautiful union of the man-built environment with a natural environment. So that's been our long look at environmental anthropology in ancient Egypt. I'm going to sign off for now. We'll see you next time.